One consequence of our recent storm systems, you've probably noticed it in your community, all of the fallen trees, or as described by our partners at the SF Standard, I love this, tree carnage. I mean, it really grabs headlines. We have been reporting on those trees falling on power lines, on top of cars, or unfortunately, in some instances, hurting innocent bystanders. The Standard dug into the dangerous problem and say tree loss across the city is even worse than you probably think. So joining us live now is Julie Zagoras, a reporter for the SF Standard who worked on this piece. First off, I have to commend you. This is a very in-depth article, and I learned a lot, as I'm sure you did as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So let's start off with this question. Why are so many trees falling in the city? I think initial reports mentioned in your article from last Tuesday's storm, more than 700. We know about issues of softening soil, but what else?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different factors. I mean, one thing is just the intensity of these storms to begin with. We've seen almost 80-mile-per-hour winds. We've seen multiple bomb cyclones, atmospheric rivers. And when the soil gets so saturated with water and then more water falls, there's nothing for the roots to hold on to, which makes it a lot easier for trees to topple. But what I really tried to explore in my article was that it's not just about the storm weather. There are also pre-existing conditions of these trees that have made them more vulnerable and more susceptible to tree failure. And some of those include poor pruning over many years, decades of private pruning that did not, keep up with adequate care for the trees, which made them very top heavy and so more susceptible to wind. Also, trees being planted in very narrow sidewalk strips where their roots can't really dig in and take hold. And other factors as well, like planting non-native trees all throughout San Francisco that might not be best adapted to our weather here.
I think you actually linked in your article another piece saying that there are a number of tree species that should never have been planted to begin with. And was one of the palm trees one of those? I don't recall.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, some of our most what we call historic trees, and yes, that's a thing, the trees in San Francisco can be designated as historic landmarks, are not native trees to San Francisco, but these beautiful, luxurious palms that we sort of equate with the California lifestyle, but none of those species of palm, including the canary date palm, which are those beautiful palms that line Dolores Avenue, none of those are native to San Francisco. Those trees do, though, however, hold up pretty well in windstorms because you can imagine thinking of a palm tree in Florida, it can almost get bent down to the ground and spring back up again. So we haven't seen as many palm trees fail, but they are trees that technically shouldn't really be planted here.
Yeah, my producer Steve says ficus is also on that list as well. That can cause some major problems, and we've seen it. One gripe that we've heard from viewers, certainly people in my very own San Francisco neighborhood, is that days after tree branches fell and littered the streets, they would block roads and cause headaches. They were still there. So the question stands is who exactly is responsible for cleaning up the mess?
Yeah, so typically Department of Public Works will come to clean up fallen street trees, but there were so many incident reports in such a short amount of time that what they had to do basically was triage the situation and move out of the way limbs that were maybe blocking traffic or, very dangerous, and then they would leave the rest and come back to it later because there were so many trees falling across the city that they were not able to respond to all of them at once.
Yeah, and she spoke about the difference between 311 and calling 911 earlier in our show and how there was such an influx to both that it was almost overwhelming to one point. Something that was in your article that I did not know about was the shrinking tree canopy in San Francisco, that the rate of new trees being planted does not equal the rate of them being removed. Can you elaborate more on that?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really concerning trend because we already have one of the smallest urban canopies in the U.S. Our tree cover is about 13%, whereas LA's is around 20%. Portland, Seattle's 30%. So we have a very small urban canopy to begin with. And with the rate of trees that either die naturally or need to be removed for other reasons, we're not keeping up even close with the planting just to make up for those trees that naturally die off or get removed every year, let alone are we building up our tree canopy, which is part of San Francisco's climate resiliency plan, is to plant more trees because trees are a natural carbon sink, and this is one of the most effective ways to fight climate change. So it is a plan for the city to plant more trees, and yet we are so far behind in even just maintaining what we have, let alone planting even more street trees. So it's a really big problem.
It's a problem, and planting trees sounds like an easy fix. However, you mentioned that it can cost a pretty penny to plant a tree and also maintain it, not to mention. So what else realistically can be done? And this may take years.
I think there needs to be more funding. So Prop E, which was passed by voters in 2016 and took effect in 2017, a lot of people think, well, oh, this took care of the trees, but really it only helped with tree pruning and tree removal and sidewalk repair. But there's no funds in Prop E for tree planting. And so there really needs to be some money within the city government to dedicate to tree planting, given the expense and yet also given how important it is, especially in light of how many tree failures we've had lately.
Yeah, it almost feels like last Tuesday's storm was a wake-up call to get people to understand just how serious this issue is. Julie, before you go, I do want to ask you this. I mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation that I found your article very informative. Can you tell me about the reporting process? Because you mentioned that you culled through all of the data and also were asking people to come forward if they have reports of trees. What was that research process like, and how long did you have to work on this?
It was pretty complex, and part of what made it difficult was that there is no fewer than 22 different jurisdictions that oversee trees in San Francisco. So just getting numbers from one department took upwards of a week or two, and they had to piece together their own numbers. And then a lot of fallen branches are mistaken for trees, and so the numbers are not always quite accurate. So it's really hard to gauge the actual number of trees that have fallen in San Francisco. And given that there are so many different agencies, everyone from Department of Public Works to MUNI to Caltrans, to SFPUC that oversee trees, it can be really complicated to understand what does the overall holistic picture, what does it look like? And you have to do a little bit of digging into reports and talk to a lot of different agencies as well as arborists and other people who are familiar with kind of the general overall landscape of the urban canopy of San Francisco.
I can imagine.